Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Yael. Obviously, welcome, Stephan. Welcome, Cynthia. Welcome to all of our guests. We're delighted to be having this talk again. And obviously, we feel hugely privileged, or I certainly feel very privileged to have been keeping such interesting company for so very long. And I am delighted to hear what the three of you have to share. Cynthia, I don't know if you want to just maybe camera on there. And then I suppose over to you, Stephan, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. As they say, flattery will get you anywhere. But thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful summer's day. Well, at least the last time I looked outside. It's so good to see that eventually the rain arrived here in Gauteng, so it makes these typical summer days just more enjoyable. So typically in our tradition of holding these webinars, of course, largely being forced onto us by COVID, we've decided to deviate slightly from our normal format of inviting subject matter experts to talk about their respective fields of knowledge, to presenting some of the work of our own members and, talking a little bit and giving insights into the different projects that they've been keeping themselves busy with. You may recall that one of the main aims of the EPA is to share best practice, thought leadership, and continuous development for our members. So we want to present today a discussion by three members, me being one, who will be discussing the different insights from their research into applied ethics and specifically into the MPhil thesis that they've done now recently. We hope that you enjoy this practical format and maybe even inspires you to go into or maybe further your own studies into the field of applied ethics. I want to introduce our resident chairperson of the board, and for today also our facilitator and one of our presenters, Cynthia Schoeman. Now, Cynthia deservedly refers to herself as an ethics activist, but Cynthia is also the managing director of Ethics Monitoring and Management Services. She is obviously a non-executive director of the EPA and sits on the investigative committee of EPA. She has decades, and I'm not going to even try and look for a number. She's got decades worth of experience in the field of workplace ethics and governance. And then Cynthia has also published multiple books and articles on workplace ethics, too many to mention here, and surely one of our highest regarded members of the EPA. So Cynthia, thank you very much. I'm going to give over to you today, and good luck. Thank you.
Stephan, thank you as always for the introduction, and what a generous introduction, how very kind of you. I think that all of us here are deeply immersed in ethics, so I think all of our contribution needs to be recognized. But as the EPA, we thought that seeing we're sitting on wonderful pieces of very current research into ethics, we thought it would be really great to share it with you. And as I say, I think the relevance is also that it's very current. As Stephan said, this was research that the three of us did for an MPhil in applied ethics at the University of Stellenbosch. Before I start, I'm going to start with Yael, but before I start, can I remind you that as always, Sarah will be managing questions and comments, so please feel free to pose those. We really do welcome the engagement. And with that, let me start with you, Yael, and by way of introduction, can I say that Yael is, as Stephan mentioned, of course, Yael is a non-executive director of the Ethics Practitioners Association, but she also works, I feel like, the Ethics Practitioners Association takes up a lot, but there is also that other real role of being the ethics officer for the whole Discovery group. So a very significant immersion, if you want, in ethics. And Yael, your research was entitled Incentives, Virtues, and Big Data Organizations. And in terms of discussing this to share some of the practical findings you arrived at, perhaps it'd be useful just for a moment to start off with How do you see the issue of big data organizations? It's perhaps an obvious question, but can we start there?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Cynthia, and thank you, everybody. Good morning to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us. We really hope this is an interactive session. So I love the first question asking about big data, because it's been a bit of a buzzword, but not everybody actually knows what it involves. And when I was choosing my thesis topic, I was trying to find something that is quite current and something that we need to think about in our moral future. So big data analytics describes the use of analyzing big data sets of information, and this is done to provide valuable insights. So big data organizations, although they're like any other organization, what generally happens is they use big data analytics to produce new information, to identify trends and patterns, to personalize products and services, and to create a competitive advantage. So although we've always done so with marketing, and we look for information and who do we market and what do we market, big data has just increased this volume to unbelievable amounts of information that organizations can use to create a competitive advantage.
But Yael, I mean, thank you for that. I think that just in describing that, what emerges, and I appreciate we, of course, are focused on ethics, what emerges is that there are, of course, major ethical concerns associated with big data. Won't you talk us through that a little bit?
Absolutely. And that's probably the most important element. So although there's so many advantages of what this brings to business, it really has created major debates from politicians to influencers to activists to consumers in terms of what does this mean for our moral future. And we've really realized that as technology has advanced, the sometimes I'll be speaking about something and I'm very sure that Facebook has heard me because the next thing that is the next advert that is on my feed. And so it becomes quite worrying in terms of, how does social media know that these are the things I'm talking about? And to more serious topics such as, is it ethical to influence decision-making based on using these personal details? If you may remember the Cambridge Analytica and Facebook debacle in 2016. Yeah. And that was scary in that this information was now being used to target specific individuals with specific information that would influence an election. And so those have become, really big spoken about ethical challenges. And so what this has resulted in is a growing awareness and around the manipulation of people's attention through technology of data. And this has then created calls for more transparency, accountability, because we are grabbing people's attention and they may not even be aware of it. They're more than likely not aware of it. And what are we then doing with that information? So this has created a real big ethical challenge of privacy and the protection of personal data, because people didn't even know what their data was being used for and how they were being manipulated.
Yeah, and I mean, that's aside from the fact that when big data gets stolen, I mean, that's another whole concern.
Absolutely.
So I think you're quite right. I think that these loom very large at the moment. But yeah, what I found interesting, I mean, I found a whole pile of things interesting about your research.
Thank you.
But the fact that you focused on incentives as a potential organizational tool to promote ethical behavior, but specifically in big data organizations, I thought this was a very interesting focus. Why did you choose this particular focus?
Thank you. Thank you for the compliment, Cynthia. And it is very interesting. And there's so much research and so much information and still so much we don't know. But really what I realized is that the ethical landscape has changed due to this implementation of big data organizations, of the digital era. And this raises questions where if we can still use our conventional organizational tools, using a code of ethics and policies, is this really going to work in the digital era? And so I wanted to see, are there other tools that we could use? Because clearly it's not working. There's so much unethical behavior around us in South Africa, across the globe, and the current strategies don't seem to be working. We're facing an alarming amount of ethical scandals, which has severe consequences for our moral future. And so I really was wondering, are there other ways that we could do this? And a quote that came to mind while I was, looking at this research was attributed to Albert Einstein, that says the problems that exist in the world today cannot be solved by the level of thinking that created them. And that reminded me, we've created this world that we're in now. We need to think differently about how we're going to face these challenges. So I really wanted the topic in terms of how do we change the ethical landscape that we have now created, and what tools could we do so? And incentives is such a big tool. Money is just what makes the world go round and what drives people's behavior. And so I really thought that would be something very interesting to use. As you know, as you mentioned when you introduced me, I'm a group ethics officer at Discovery, and most of you may be aware how Discovery uses behavioral economics. And we design all our products aimed at positively changing behavior using incentives. So this gave me the idea is, could we do this for ethical behavior? And I know very controversial, and if it's not a question on the chat yet, I'm sure it's coming, and I will address it around why should we pay people to be ethical? And that's not necessarily, what the founders came out with, but the original premise was, can we use incentives? Incentives are already being used in organizations. And so we use incentives because we want people to do what's expected of them and to exceed, to do what's expected of them. And so if we're using incentives to drive behavior, couldn't we also use incentives to drive ethical behavior? And so I thought that would be something that could be really interesting to research.
I agree. I mean, as you say, use of incentives is a very long-term topic, but this focus is, much needed, to say the least. But Yael, talk us through, what were the findings that your research came up with?
Sure. So first I looked at what type of framework can I use in terms of ethical theories. So although I was looking at practical applications of incentives, what type of behavior were we even trying to incentivize? So I needed to decide what type of ethical decision-making are we actually wanting organizations and individuals to make? What behavior do we want the incentives to drive? So when I looked through the normative ethical approaches, I really liked the idea of virtue ethics. And I really thought this would be well suited to the problem that we're experiencing, because this theory looks at the characteristics of an individual as well as an organization. And so the traits that are discussed in virtue ethics, and some of you may know, has come from ancient Greek times. It's just really about what kind of person do I want to be, what type of organization do we want to build. And so looking at utilitarianism, where we want to do the best for most people, but there's still going to be a small cause, a little bit of harm, but it's still going to exist. Or looking at a rules-driven theory such as deontology, where we may now need to police these rules. Just doesn't seem to be working. And these are the tools we've been using all this time. And we still find ourselves in a space where we have all these moral theories around us, but we still have excessive unethical behavior. So I thought that virtue ethics is something that could be quite helpful to help guide people's behavior and to be doing the right thing. And then I brought in incentives to say, could we then use this to reinforce that behavior? So if we're asking people to behave in a certain way, for the organization to behave in a certain way, how do we then reward employees for doing so? And the findings really reveal that well-managed incentives can really improve performance. It drives individuals' intrinsic interest in their work tasks and even extrinsic motivation. And so I really thought maybe for both. So intrinsically, we're looking at the type of person I want to be, the innate kind of person I am. And this is very often where virtue ethics come in. I want to be a kind person. I want to be an honest person. I want to be a courageous person. And then if I am showing those behaviors, if the organization is showing to be a trustworthy organization, there should be some form of reward recognition in place. And so not necessarily financial incentives. I really look more along non-financial incentives that already exist within the organization. So how do we reward people? How do we promote people? How do we do performance reviews? How do we do increase reviews? All of these practices are already in place in most organizations. So can we add an ethical element to it? Can there be an ethics metric? So it's all very well, you're a great performer, you have a wonderful team, you drive results, but how do you do that? Do you do it in an ethical manner? Should you be promoted where other people see you as a role model? And so putting the two together around virtue behavior and ethics really showed there was quite a bit of research and quite a bit of information, wonderful books to read. If this is a topic that really interests you, there's a book by Shannon Veller called Technological Moral Values, and very, very interesting book in terms of how you can use certain virtues to drive ethical behavior. And that can then become objective information that you can use. So if there's certain virtues we want you to use in an organization, honesty, integrity, fairness, kindness, any form of virtue, you can actually then put descriptive behaviors to those virtues, and you can measure it. And if people are behaving in a certain way, then those are the people you want to be your leaders, your managers, the people that are rewarded, recognized, and promoted.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, what comes out of that so strongly for me is, just a quick comment that you passed, but I really want to give emphasis to, is you're talking about incentives, but the words that leapt out for me were well designed, that it's really applying your mind to it to make sure that you are realizing the intended consequences and not some other random consequence. But I mean, in conclusion, I wonder if you could wrap up for us around, are there any potential risks? So I don't necessarily want to end on a negative note, so just start thinking of that one positive comment.
Yes, absolutely.
But I think in terms of looking at the research you did, I think that's an important dimension of your focus on incentives. Are there any risks?
Absolutely. I mean, one I alluded to before is a lot of people aren't comfortable saying that we should incentivize ethical behavior, and do people need to be paid to be ethical? Is this not something we expect of employees, of individuals, to behave ethically, and why would you want to pay people to be ethically? Sometimes financial incentives can suggest that the organization is putting a price on ethics, and employees may even find it quite insulting that you have to pay me to be ethical. This isn't the type of organization I want to work for. Also, just incentives in general sometimes really creates unintended consequences. Employees sometimes then cut corners, or they falsify figures, or they break the law because they want to reach this reward, this incentive. And so there's always been some negative connotations on incentives. But absolutely, in terms of making sure that they're not subjective, that they can be objective, the information, the research really shows that although there are these risks involved, it's also very important that there are so many positives, and I believe the positives outweigh these risks, and the risks can be mitigated by the comment you highlighted earlier about embedding ethics in an organization reward system. You can do so by ensuring that you do so constructively, that there is a system in place, that there is metrics in place, that people are being fairly measured against these metrics, and then rewarding or coaching or punishing the unethical behavior. So as long as these risks we're aware of them and we can mitigate them, they help us design a great incentive system. So, we can't just do it for the pros that we see. We need to know these are the risks, and this is how we must design the system to ensure that we cater for defined metrics in place so that it's not subjective, that there are fair processes in place, that it's not becoming unfair and discriminative, because people may want to measure incentives and it becomes objective in, well, the manager likes this particular individual, and so therefore they're the ones that believe that behave ethically. And so you've got to have these objective incentives in place, and you can definitely mitigate these risks.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for that overview. And I think in wrapping up, you know, as I say, when I looked at this topic, I think we would all appreciate the huge risks that go around the capability and the extent to which big data can intrude upon our lives in you know, the most unethical ways. But again, I think that if we just pause, we can look at positive ways and of influencing behavior. And I think, whereas you say, you know, someone might say, I don't want to work for an organization where we have to really promote ethical behavior. But I mean, the concluding point I would share on that is, if we just paused for a moment and said, would you want to work for an ethical company, or would you want to work for an unethical company? Mm-hmm. You know, the answer is so very straightforward that I would certainly fall into the camp of saying that when we're looking at great research like this, that is giving us practical insight around well-designed incentives that can build a more ethical workplace, you know, for me, that's a very huge tick. So thank you so much for sharing your research with us.
Thank you.
For me, that was really great. Yeah, thank you. I hope for those of you listening that added insight as well. In terms of timing, then, Stephan, I'd like to move on to your research then. And again, let me also formally introduce Stephan. As you well know, Stephan is the CEO of the Ethics Practitioners Association. And like Yael, is also a group ethics officer for the Discovery Group. So again, not only contributing to our industry, but also involved in a very real world way in very serious ethics. So Stephan, thank you for sharing with us. Can I just tell you, you're still on mute? No, that's fine.
There we go.
Excellent. And let me share the formal title of Stephan's research. As all of them, it was, as I said, for an MPhil in applied ethics. And his topic was an explanation for the emerging shift from compliance culture to ethical culture in the financial industry. Stephan, if I can start in terms of our discussion, what I thought was, I mean, many interesting points, but what I really liked is that your research started with an overview of the very large corporate scandals. And, you know, I sometimes think we're so overwhelmed by what's happening now that we fail to recognize the huge history. Why don't you just contextualize your research in that regard for us?
Yeah. Thank you for the kind introduction, Cynthia. And yes, you know, this topic has actually multiple kind of starting points for me, and one being my own career. I've got a law and compliance background, and since the start of my career, I moved through, you know, my legal kind of my law career into compliance. I've been a compliance officer for many years, and then for the last 8 years, an ethics practitioner. So, you know, I was kind of interested in what motivated me and what caused me to go through this process. And I thought, when the idea came up for me to choose a topic, you know, it would be ideal to see, you know, if there's any theory behind or research behind this kind of phenomenon that seems to be happening worldwide. So I grabbed the opportunity with both hands, and I looked into the research part of it. So, you know, as part of this thesis, I went back and I thought probably the best way to start is to look at major corporate failures. And in my research, I went back probably about 100 years, and I realized that corporate scandals is not something new. I mean, in 1913, being almost 100 years, a little bit over 100 years ago, there was the first corporate scandal, a major bank in Germany, accounting scandal, and that's where, you know, at least in recent history, in terms of my research, it all started. I went through the process, and I realized that around the early 2000s, there was a major kind of waypoint in this whole kind of transition. And it started essentially, in terms of my research, with a major corporate scandal that everyone still talks about, and that was Enron.
Yes.
And although Enron is not a financial services player, it was pretty much the catalyst for this whole kind of transition and emergence. Shortly after Enron happened, there was WorldCom, another non-financial services, but again, that kind of triggered a major regulatory response from regulators. And you know, I think those of you who are interested would know that that was the birth of Sarbanes-Oxley. And Sarbanes-Oxley kind of attempted to deal with accounting standards and scandal. And but you know, it was just a kind of forerunner for the most significant kind of corporate scandal that happened a few years later, and that was the credit crunch of the major financial downturn that happened in 2008. And that kind of was, again, the catalyst for another major regulatory intervention called the Dodd-Frank Act. But that was international, and Europe had their own version of the Dodd-Frank Act, and they introduced it, and there was major intervention from a regulatory side. So my study kind of went a little bit further, and I looked at, you know, so obviously we had these corporate failures, huge, massive interventions from a regulatory side that resulted in the emergence of a compliance culture. And then I thought, well, I mean, if you've got a compliance culture, why aren't things not really getting better? Because we all know that in 2012, we had the Barclays Bank scandal, we had the Libor scandal, you know, it just doesn't seem to stop. So I looked into the reasons why this compliance culture don't seem to be effective for a sustainable transition of the financial services industry. So I looked at my research, I looked at that, and then, you know, eventually, you know, what are regulators now suggesting to do, and, you know, what is currently happening in that space.
Stephan, before we continue, I mean, I think scoping that background and connecting the dots so strongly between that huge spike in corporate scandals and the huge regulations that follows, I think creates a wonderful platform, as you've just done, to explain that huge focus on compliance, which, I mean, we're going to get to is not the same as a focus on ethics. But before we continue, I know that you did your research in the financial industry, but, you know, of course, there are many more industries in terms of the participants listening. Do you, I mean, can you comment on whether you think there's an applicability to other industries before we move into the findings of your research?
Yes, absolutely. I certainly believe so. And I mean, the research is quite clear. As I said, WorldCom and Enron and, you know, many other international companies like the Volkswagen emission scandal happened outside of the financial services industry, and they keep on happening. In the South African space, we, you know, we have Steinhoff, we have Tongaat Hewlett, who are all non-financial companies involved in huge corporate scandals. And so to answer your question, I don't believe this is isolated to the financial services industry. It happens everywhere. And I've made a note in my thesis that that's maybe a topic for a future study, to look at what the impact in the non-financial services sphere is. You know, whether it's similar or as impactful as in the financial services sphere.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems to me it has absolute applicability across a vast array of organizations. That yes, the compliance issue has arisen enormously for so many organizations, but where you ended off, I'd like to pick up from that of saying, given this huge focus, understandable for the reasons you've just shared, on compliance, moving towards an ethics focus, can we pause there and can you talk us through what the difference is there before we move on to what the findings were in terms of your research?
So the difference between a compliance culture and an ethical culture, is that your question? So, I mean, I think most of us attending this session would know that there is obviously a difference, but essentially my research into it kind of revealed that a compliance culture is very much a rule-based culture, where the focus is on the letter of the law, and there's extrinsic motivation. And what I mean by extrinsic motivation, and I will talk about it later, about what I call the dark side of compliance, is where the motivation for complying comes from external sources. And that results often in what they call a fear-based approach to compliance, where organizations comply for the fear or the impact of external factors. For example, a huge fine. We've seen in South Africa the huge fines possible for non-compliance, and that is the extrinsic motivation that many organizations use for complying. And then obviously a compliance culture is very reactive, where it often happens where the mischief happens and where the wrongdoing happens, and then the regulator introduces compliance or regulatory requirements to try and address issues that has already happened. And that obviously is not the ideal. When you look at the ethics culture, by comparison, it's obviously very principle-based, outcomes-based, where it is looked at a broad perspective and not very specific issues that's wrong. It also creates a very sustainable, values-based conduct in the organization. And, as on the opposite side of the scale, it's very intrinsic. The motivation is very intrinsic. In other words, it's the reason for complying or the reason for conducting in an ethical way comes from inside, where employees and leaders do it for the right reasons and their own reasons, and not because they're fearful of compliance sanction or fines and so forth and so forth. So very two different cultures. And as I said, my research seemed to suggest that there is this kind of emergence of a transition from compliance to an ethical culture.
Yeah. And I think, Stephan, it warrants emphasis that compliance culture, being rule-based, of course has a place. But when we add to it the proactive value-based system of an ethical system, I think then we're looking at a very, very rich combination. So, in that, just an added question, I certainly see this, that it's not an either or, it's an and. But given that you've done the detailed research, what is your view?
Absolutely. I've looked at it, and I call it an explanation for the shift. But by saying it's a shift, I realize that it's not an absolute shift where you will find that the compliance culture eventually gets replaced by an ethical culture. I believe that the ethical culture will get bigger and bigger, but there will also always be room for both. And I think they need each other. And there's a reason to work off the synergies of that these two approaches can provide. The Ethics Institute's got this model, they call the management mode of ethics inside of organizations. And depending on the culture of the organization and where they are in terms of their maturity, ethical maturity, will require a kind of approach that either has a bit of compliance where, it's very immature and a very immoral culture. Mm-hmm. There, the compliance kind of focus will be more pronounced than the ethical one. But as the company or the organization moves towards a totally aligned kind of management mode, the ethical culture will be more pronounced there. So I think there should be good interaction between the two, and there's a place for both to coexist in a healthy organization.
Excellent. And two questions at the risk of overloading you. Two questions. One is, I know one of the things you looked at was in terms of the compliance focus, what were the unintended consequences? And let me juxtapose with that with the fact that I know you also looked at really spelling out beyond what you said the advantages of an ethical culture. But I think those unintended consequences was something you specifically looked at.
Yes, and that was the reason, one of the reasons why I focused on the financial services industry, because as we know, the financial services industry is probably the highest regulated sector or industry as a sector. And, I thought that if I can try and find out why, despite being so highly and overly regulated, the compliance approach does not give the required outcomes. It should give us some insights into it. And when I looked at it, I realized that, and I call it the dark side of compliance. And, what I found was that in a compliance culture, often, having this approach has unintended consequences. And I listed a few of these, and they are just basically, firstly, the significant cost of compliance. Now, I mean, we all know that compliance teams and compliance departments are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the scope bigger and bigger, and that obviously has a resultant cost. So, I mean, in the US, for example, back in 2017, I mean, up to 10% of companies, the big banks, turnovers were for compliance costs. So huge impacts of up to 10% of their total costs, which is massive and huge. Yeah. And, you know, obviously the increasing complexity of compliance makes it very difficult. Multinational companies operate in different global jurisdictions, and many of these jurisdictions are not aligned. So trying to have an effective compliance framework for these organizations is very, very difficult, and you need someone who needs to look at these constantly, again, increasing the costs. The third one that I found is what I call the fear-driven compliance approach. That's one of the unintended consequences. As I mentioned earlier, fear-driven compliance is not the right way to do compliance. I mean, it's very reactive, it's not proactive, and it relies on extrinsic motivation rather than intrinsic motivation. So it's the fear of these huge fines, which is not great, and you know, not great for the organization. The other one that I looked at was what I called window dressing compliance. I mean, that kind of speaks for itself. I mean, Enron was a great example of that, where internationally, where everything on the face of it looks great. You've got your control functions, you've got compliance functions, they've got internal, external audit, and everything seems to be great. And you know, you've got all the standards up on the walls, and everything seems to be great. But yet, underneath, there's very little substance to that. We saw it in South Africa with Steinhoff.
Indeed.
A very similar situation where everything looks great, everything is in place, but it's all window dressing, and that was a problem for many companies. The second last one is what I call tick box compliance. Yeah. Often that happens in organizations where, you know, compliance departments put together just a tick box. You know, do you do this, then tick it, then it's fine. You tick that box, then it's fine. And there's no substance to that approach to compliance, and often ends up in a very bad situation for companies. The last one of the unintended consequences, and what I call the dark side, is what I call malicious compliance. And now malicious compliance is probably a version of tick box compliance, where organizations do it for the wrong reasons, and they're doing it in a way that they just kind of scrape through the bare minimum of being compliant. In my research, I looked at one of these investment banks in the US, part of the financial crisis, where one of the compliance requirements was, for example, where they issue loans to customers that are for longer than a year, in other words, 365 days, they need to keep a certain amount of reserves in the bank. So what they did is they actually reduced that to 364 days in order to circumvent that requirement. Now that's just an extreme example of malicious compliance, where they're trying to circumvent a very specific rule by just kind of slipping through the other way. And so those were the unintended consequences and the dark side of compliance that I found ultimately resulted in a compliance culture not being effective in affecting the culture in a very sustainable way.
But Stephan, if I could ask you then to wrap up, I mean, whether you want to wrap up in terms of the key practical lessons of your research, or whether you want to wrap up in terms of the key benefits of pursuing an ethical culture, I mean, I'll leave that to you. But what would your key concluding messages be out of your research?
Cynthia, so obviously I looked at the benefits for ethical organizations, and I found quite a few. I was actually surprised to see how many benefits they are. And obviously the first benefit are for the supervisors and the regulators, because if the organizations they regulate have an ethical culture, it means that they have to be less reactive and can be more proactive, because the motivation for being compliant comes from the regulated entity. So they are pushing more and more and more for an ethical culture to be adopted in these organizations. I mean, obviously, intrinsic motivation drives ethical behavior. And once you get that ball rolling, I mean, it's very difficult to stop. And that's the problem with extrinsic motivation, is as soon as that motivation disappears,
indeed,
your motivation stops. And that kind of deals with that. Ethical organizations observe spirit of the law. Ethics, I don't have to say much more about that. But I think that, rather than the rule of law, rather go for the spirit of the law ethics. And then ultimately, what I was absolutely happy or delighted to find was that ethical organizations are better performers. They actually outperform the organizations that are not, because often ethics officers battle to make a business case for being ethical. Because, in big organizations where you've got accountants and actuaries, they look at the bottom line. And what's so motivating for this is that you can actually prove now, and I've done so through my research, that ethical organizations are better performers. They have a competitive advantage over their peers. I mean, in America, there's an organization called the Ethisphere Institute. Yeah. And every year they've got a competition for the world's most ethical companies. And, they revealed that organizations are becoming increasingly aware that a strong ethical culture is critical to achieving financial performance. Yeah. So much so that the companies that's been nominated as the world's most ethical companies outperform their peers by between 10 and 14% on their share prices, which is huge. And yeah. I think a huge incentive for organizations to be ethical, because now they can prove black and white that there's a benefit to being ethical rather than not.
Stephan, I think that is the perfect concluding point. So thank you very much for sharing with us.
Only a pleasure.
Certainly, I think that collectively, this is adding valuable insight. And I hope for some of you just reconfirming and reinforcing what you already know in terms of what the right approach is. But I think we're looking at here really, really great research lessons. What I'm going to do now is just talk through the research I did briefly, and quite a different topic. I can certainly see such great connections between what Yael and Stephan did. Let me get rid of this reminder on my screen, and there we are. And the topic I looked at was entitled "Supply Chain Slavery: The Case for Corporate Responsibility Beyond Direct Suppliers." And perhaps a good way to start to just talk you through my research was to say, why did I choose this topic? And again, in all fairness, I have looked at what I have called supply chain ethics. I've looked at that for a long time, and I've spoken about it and written about it. Now, if we're looking at supply chain ethics, there's some obvious things. And there are obvious things like, does the organization pay suppliers on time? Do they adopt bullying tactics with suppliers? So there are a lot of very obvious things that we would be familiar with in terms of supply chain ethics, and much of that would revolve around fairness. But the far, far bigger issue in terms of what I call supply chain ethics focuses on the working conditions in the supplier organizations. And specifically here, we're looking at human rights abuse. In terms of my research, what it really focused on was human rights abuse, but the banner term that is now very largely used internationally is modern slavery. And let me just share with you that in terms of the United Nations definition, modern slavery is forced labor, debt bondage, forced marriage, and human trafficking. And specifically, it refers to situations of exploitation that a person cannot refuse or cannot leave because of threats, violence, coercion, deception, and or abuse of power. So as I say, what my research focused on was human rights abuse in employment practices. Of course, there's human rights abuse in many other domains, but I was looking at it in employment practices and specifically within supply chains. And the reason for this is that when I went into that, it was found that human rights abuse, modern slavery, mostly occurred in labor-intensive industries, in low-skilled type roles, and in under-regulated industries. But what was so pointed was that modern slavery is pervasive in corporate supply chains. I think what's interesting is also to get a perspective on if you want the extent of the problem. And for that, what I'd like to compare modern slavery to is to historical slavery, you know, classically the Atlantic slave trade. Now, if we're looking at historical slavery, I mean, we all know that slavery was largely abolished in the 19th century. Interestingly, Spain, it started with Spain in 1811. We would know that there's the 1948 UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which specifically prohibits slavery and slave trade in all its forms. But let me just stress here, I think it does come through in the UN definition, that unlike historical slavery, can we be clear that modern slavery is usually contractual? In some cases, the person may actually voluntarily enter into an employment agreement, and then from there, they become trapped for the reasons I mentioned of coercions or threats or the like. If we look at the scope of modern slavery, I think this is really scary. The most recent statistics we have, which I used in my research, and those are unfortunately still the most recent statistics, are the 2018 Global Slavery Index, and that was conducted among 167 countries. And you know, if we look at the men, women, and children who are victims of modern slavery, that figure is 40.3 million people. And that is a 2018 figure. Now, you know, I don't want to pretend I can predict what happened, but, you know, I absolutely bet you that number has not gone down. Given what we've been through, I would absolutely say that number's gone up. I'm going to break down that further, but just by way of a comparison, when we look at historical slavery, classically the Atlantic slave trade, I actually quite battled with that because there's a huge, there's some variation in how many people were actually involved in that slave trade. And one of the most reputable sources I found put that number at 11.9 million. Now, I mean, that was an atrocity that we obviously are all aware of, but historical slavery, 11.9 million, current modern slavery, well, current 2018, 40.3 million. And the stats that underpin that 40.3 million are really scary. Women and girls constitute 71% of modern slavery. And by the way, children alone constitute 25% of modern slavery. Here, connecting it to business, which is what I was focusing on, when we're looking specifically at the private sector, 80% of forced labor is in the private sector, and 70% of trafficked victims are in the private sector. So, I mean, these are very scary numbers. Briefly, I'm sure you're aware of the examples. Agriculture is a big area. You'd be aware of abuses in the cocoa/chocolate industry, West Africa. And there we're not only talking about child labor, we're talking about child trafficking. Tobacco industry. I mean, I could mention any number of areas of agriculture, whether it's tobacco, cotton, the list goes on. The one I hadn't expected that was really strong was in the fishing industry. I mean, in Thailand, for example, the atrocities are too terrifying. The abuse, amounts to outright, murder that is never followed up on. You would similarly be aware of massive human rights abuses in the clothing industry, in mining, and honestly, the list, unfortunately, just goes on and on. I think the other interesting thing is that we shouldn't just assume that this sort of abuse of modern slavery is happening in, third world or less developed countries. I happened to do a talk on this topic in Australia, and I actually used local examples there. So it is happening all around the world. The key question I focused on, as I said at the outset, was to what extent are corporates responsible for these human rights abuses in their supply chains? And for that, I really had to look at the nature of supply chains. And what was, of course, the key factor is that supply chains are not just that direct or first tier supplier that you'd be familiar with. The problem is the multiple, and I mean many multiples of indirect and what are often called sub-tier suppliers. And it goes right down, but really it extends very far into what are called shadow factories of informal, unethical outlets or manufacturing spots that are not adhering human rights standards even vaguely. And of course, the greater risk of modern slavery is in these very distant indirect suppliers. My research looked at quite a couple of things. One that was encouraging was that we already have internationally 3 global frameworks that speak very strongly of corporate responsibility for supply chains. And that is the UN Global Compact, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. Out of that, let me share a comment that I think really captures a key point and a challenging point. It was made by the chair of the OECD guidelines when they were doing a revision. And what he said is, you can outsource your production, but you cannot outsource your responsibility. And I think that, and again, you might automatically want to argue against that of saying, yes, but I think it captures it extraordinarily well. Let me say, in my research, I of course acknowledged and identified that there's great work being done by civil society organizations, by NGOs, organizations like the Walk Free Foundation. By the way, the Walk Free Foundation is the one who runs the Global Slavery Index. The International Cocoa Initiative, certainly Human Rights Watch, there are organizations that are doing amazing work. What my research also looked at was that there is increasing legislation. Let me tell you, South Africa does have legislation. We've got the SA Prevention and Combating of Trafficked Persons Act 7 of 2013. But, whether it's Australia, UK, USA, Germany, France, even Brazil, would you believe it, all have formal legislation around modern slavery, and much is being enacted. Let me quickly add the curveball around legislation. That, of course, legislation is good, but it has been certainly in academic circles, it has been much criticized, and you can think, why would someone criticize the legislation? Surely this is a good thing. And it adds a little bit to Stephan's discussion. The reason it's being criticized is saying that governments, in formulating regulations imposed on corporates around practices in their supply chain, is in fact ignoring their own responsibility for human rights abuse in the country, and if you want, passing that on to the corporate. So just an interesting thought there. But let me tell you that the key finding that I think is really, really crucial to understand, and the key argument I used in terms of saying, yes, we've got these global frameworks, and there are many other factors. I went deeply into stakeholder analysis, and that was another big argument that I won't go into. But a key factor in terms of saying corporates are absolutely responsible for what's happening in their supply chains was the corporate, I can say, complicity in the formation of these very lengthy, very fragmented, and very complex supply chains. But let me phrase it differently. It's because corporates deliberately created and pursued this business model of these very lengthy supply chains. And why was that done? It was done in pursuit of the business goal of reduced cost and reduced risk. And this has been widely practiced, as we are aware, that supply chains are managed in terms of a business model that reduces for the corporate, that reduces cost and reduces risk. No surprise that that business model has put pressure on suppliers all the way down the track. And it is a huge contributing factor to the abuses that are occurring. So as you can imagine, of course, my research made the point that corporates have a responsibility in terms of modern slavery, human rights abuses in their supply chains, not just in those direct suppliers, but a much more difficult task in the many indirect suppliers. And let me perhaps wrap up. I see we've got a minute left. Let me perhaps wrap up on a personal note, which I also brought into my research, of saying we can look at this, as this did, as a corporate responsibility. But can I also conclude and bring it back to ourselves? That can we see that our personal role can have an impact, especially in this very interconnected world of today? That the organizations and products we support has an impact exactly as the organizations and products that we boycott can have an impact. And there are many examples of this that we can come up with. I think the classic example of Nike, and that was back in the 90s, and I bet you still all remember that. I mean, there was a major boycott back then around them using sweatshops and using child labor. It was mainly in Pakistan and Cambodia. But as I say, I bring it to the personal to say, can we be clear that as consumers, we are also making a regular ethical vote? Can I, on that note, wrap up and say to Stephan and to Yael, thank you so much for sharing the insight from your research. I know that sort of 15, 20-minute conversation did not speak vaguely to the uncountable number of hours that went into writing those research topics. But really, I hope for everyone who attended, can I say on behalf of the EPA, I hope it added value for you. And as always, a pleasure having you with us. Stephan, a last word to you.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Cynthia. And again, on your own research, the same, certainly added to the body of knowledge, you know, and what we're trying to achieve at the EPA. I want to, on behalf of Cynthia and Yael, say if there's any questions, any queries, feel free to send it to info@epaafrica.com, and then whoever you know, appropriate will definitely get back to you on issues around the research that we've done. Thank you very much appreciated. I hope you enjoy your day, and hopefully today this hour added a little bit to your life, and hopefully enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.